The air is heavy with salt and canvas dust. A temporary camp stretches across the coral ground, its tents arranged with quiet precision. Beyond the wire, the Pacific moves endlessly, indifferent to what has just ended here. Inside one tent, several Japanese women sit on wooden benches. Nurses, clerks, civilian auxiliaries taken during the collapse of a fortified island. Their uniforms are faded. Some still wear armbands stitched months earlier in hospitals that no longer exist. They wait, not for food, not for punishment. They wait for what they have been taught to fear most. An American officer enters, accompanied by a translator. Papers are placed on a simple field table. Names are checked. Procedures explained. The tone is calm, almost formal. Then comes the sentence that breaks the rhythm of everything they know. They are told they may answer questions, or they may refuse. No shouting follows. No raised voices. No consequences are listed. The officer makes it clear, slowly, carefully. This is not a test. It is a choice. The women do not respond immediately. Some lower their eyes. Others stare ahead, motionless. In Imperial Japan, surrender erased honor. In captivity, obedience was survival. And yet, here, refusal is permitted. That quiet contradiction hangs in the tent, pressing against years of indoctrination, and it leads directly into how this moment became possible at all. By the time these women were taken into American custody, the Pacific War had already become a war of annihilation. From its opening blows in December 1941, Imperial Japan framed the conflict not simply as a military struggle, but as a moral one. Victory was proof of spiritual superiority. Defeat was not merely failure, it was disgrace. This worldview was not limited to soldiers on the front lines. It permeated schools, factories, hospitals, and homes. Women, too, were shaped by it. In pre-war Japan, the state promoted an ideal of absolute loyalty. The emperor was sacred. The nation was eternal. The individual existed only in service. For men, this ideology manifested as Bushido, a warrior code reinterpreted for modern war. For women, it took a different form, but no less severe. They were expected to endure, obey, sacrifice, and, above all, never shame the nation. As Japan mobilized for total war, women were drawn deeper into the military system. Tens of thousands served as nurses with the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. Others worked as clerks, radio operators, factory supervisors, and logistical aides. In occupied territories, civilian women were sometimes attached to military units as support personnel. They wore uniforms. They followed orders. And they absorbed the same indoctrination. One lesson was absolute. Surrender was unforgivable. Japanese military manuals warned that capture by the enemy meant torture, humiliation, and death. Soldiers were instructed to fight until killed or to take their own lives rather than be taken alive. Nurses were told to destroy records and poison supplies before capture. Civilians were warned that Americans were brutal, racially hateful, and incapable of mercy. This belief was reinforced by action. On battlefield from China to New Guinea, Japanese forces rarely took prisoners. Those they did were often executed. At Bataan in 1942, tens of thousands of Allied prisoners suffered extreme brutality during forced marches. The message was clear, both internally and externally. Captivity was a fate worse than death. Across the Pacific, however, a very different doctrine was forming. The United States entered the war with a legal and institutional framework that viewed prisoners not as expendable enemies, but as potential sources of intelligence, and, just as importantly, as human beings bound by international law. While the U.S. had not ratified every article of the 1929 Geneva Convention, it largely adhered to its principles, especially regarding interrogation. American military intelligence manuals emphasized that prisoners were required to give only basic identifying information. Cooperation beyond that was voluntary. Physical coercion was prohibited. Psychological pressure was permitted but regulated. The logic was practical as much as moral. Information obtained under force was often unreliable. This approach was codified in training materials distributed to interrogators in the Pacific Theater. Officers were instructed to remain calm, respectful, and patient. The goal was not to dominate, but to disarm, mentally. Early encounters with Japanese prisoners were rare. In 1942 and early 1943, most Japanese troops fought to the death. Those captured were often wounded, unconscious, or isolated. Many believed they were already dead in the eyes of their homeland. But as the war shifted in 1943, so did the scale of captivity. The American strategy of island hopping, seizing key positions while bypassing others, brought U.S. forces into direct contact with Japanese garrisons under extreme pressure. At places like Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and later the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, Japanese units began to collapse under sustained bombardment, starvation, and isolation. With collapse came capture. And for the first time, American forces encountered Japanese women not as distant figures in propaganda, but as prisoners of war, individuals carrying the full weight of imperial ideology into an environment governed by very different rules. Those rules would soon collide head-on. The stage was set, but the full context of how these women came into American hands and how U.S. captivity expanded in scale and complexity still needs to be understood. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered its most destructive phase. American forces, hardened by earlier campaigns, now advanced with overwhelming material superiority. Carrier task forces dominated the seas. Strategic bombers reached farther each month. Amphibious landings were executed with mechanical precision. 4 Japanese garrisons scattered across the central and western Pacific. The margin for survival narrowed rapidly. It was in this phase that the capture of Japanese women became more frequent. Not because they were targeted, but because entire military ecosystems were collapsing. On islands such as Saipan, Tinian, and later Okinawa, Japanese defenses were no longer composed solely of frontline infantry. They included medical units, administrative offices, signal corps detachments, and civilian auxiliaries embedded within military command structures. Women served in field hospitals dug into limestone cliffs. Others worked in supply depots or intelligence offices. Many had been stationed there for years. When American forces landed on Saipan in June 1944, the scale of the defeat was immediate and catastrophic. After weeks of fighting, more than 30,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Thousands of civilians also died, many in mass suicides fueled by fear of capture. Amid the chaos, several hundred women, nurses, clerks, and support staff were taken alive. For U.S. commanders, this presented a new challenge. American POW doctrine had been designed largely with male combatants in mind. The capture of women, particularly from an enemy that denied the legitimacy of surrender, forced rapid adaptation. Temporary holding camps were established close to the front. Medical screenings were conducted. Translators were brought in. Interrogation procedures were reviewed and, in some cases, clarified. Crucially, American policy did not change. Interrogation remained voluntary. This principle was not improvised in the field. It was reinforced through military intelligence channels. U.S. Army Field Manual 30-15, along with supplementary Pacific Theater directives, emphasized that coercion was counterproductive. Prisoners were to be informed of their rights. Threats were forbidden. Violence was prohibited. Respect was not optional. It was operational doctrine. For Japanese women, this was incomprehensible. From their perspective, capture itself was already a moral collapse. They expected punishment. They expected interrogation under force. Many believed they would be executed once they ceased to be useful. Some anticipated sexual violence, a fear deliberately cultivated by Japanese propaganda. Instead, they encountered procedure. They were registered. Their wounds were treated. Food was issued. Living quarters were assigned, often segregated from male prisoners. Guards were instructed to maintain discipline and distance. American nurses sometimes assisted in care, further blurring the enemy image they had been taught. The most disorienting moment came during questioning. Interrogation rooms were plain. A table, chairs, papers. An interpreter. There were no instruments of pain, no raised voices, no time limits imposed by threat. Questions were direct and, at times, surprisingly narrow. Unit locations, medical supplies, troop movements. And then, the option was stated. They could answer, or they could refuse. This was not a trick. Reports from U.S. intelligence officers show repeated emphasis on clarity. Prisoners were informed, often multiple times, that refusal would not result in punishment. Some American interrogators even encouraged rest or postponement if a prisoner appeared distressed. 4 Japanese women trained in absolute obedience. This was destabilizing. Refusal, in their worldview, was an act of defiance. Defiance invited retaliation. Yet here, defiance was allowed, even expected. American officers noted long silences, avoided eye contact, visible confusion. Some women initially assumed the permission to refuse was itself a test, that consequences would follow later. Others believed cooperation might bring dishonor greater than any physical harm. This psychological tension did not resolve quickly. It lingered inside the camps, shaping behavior, trust, and identity. And it opened a series of deeper dynamics, human, cultural, strategic, and moral, that define the true significance of this moment. Those dynamics are best understood by examining the experience from multiple angles. The human angle, fear without a script. For the women taken prisoner, fear did not disappear upon capture. It transformed. In battle, fear had been immediate. Artillery, airstrikes, collapsing tunnels. In captivity, fear became quieter and more internal. There were no beatings to confirm their expectations. No punishment to validate what they had been taught. Instead, there was waiting, observation, uncertainty. American camp reports described Japanese women as reserved, formal, and emotionally restrained during the first weeks of detention. Many avoided conversation entirely. Some refused food. Others sat for hours without movement. This was not passivity. It was shock. The permission to refuse interrogation created a psychological vacuum. In imperial doctrine, every interaction with authority had a clear script, command and obedience. The absence of that script was terrifying. Without threat, there was no framework for response. Some women prepared themselves for consequences that never came. Others expected delayed punishment. When none followed, fear did not ease, it deepened. The cultural angle, obedience versus choice. At the heart of the shock was a cultural collision. Japanese military culture did not recognize individual rights within captivity. Authority flowed downward without negotiation. Interrogation, in this worldview, was an assertion of dominance. The captive existed to be broken, not consulted. American doctrine inverted this assumption. By allowing refusal, U.S. interrogators unintentionally challenged the legitimacy of the ideology these women had lived under for years. This was not lost on them. Post-war interviews and intelligence summaries note that some Japanese women interpreted American restraint not as kindness, but as moral weakness, at least initially. Others suspected deception. Yet over time, the consistency of the policy forced a reevaluation. If the enemy did not need to force obedience, what did that imply about power? The gender angle, women outside, the prisoner template. The presence of women in POW camps created additional complexity. Most American guards and interrogators had limited experience dealing with female prisoners from a highly patriarchal enemy culture. Special instructions were issued regarding privacy, medical care, and separation from male detainees. Female American personnel were sometimes assigned to assist, particularly nurses and administrative staff. For Japanese women, this further eroded expectations. They had been taught that American society was chaotic and morally degraded. Yet they observed women in uniform, women giving instructions, women exercising authority calmly and professionally. This did not produce immediate admiration. It produced dissonance. The permission to refuse interrogation was not an isolated policy. It existed alongside visible evidence that American women operated within structures of command and respect. Together, these observations quietly undermine deeply held assumptions. The shock, therefore, was not singular. It was layered. And as these layers accumulated, they began to affect not just the prisoners, but the intelligence process itself, the behavior of camps, and the strategic outcomes of restraint. Those consequences become clearer when viewed from the remaining angles. The intelligence angle, why voluntary interrogation worked. From American intelligence standpoint, allowing prisoners to refuse interrogation was not an act of leniency for its own sake. It was a calculated doctrine shaped by experience. By 1944, U.S. Army G2 sections in the Pacific had learned that Japanese prisoners who spoke voluntarily were far more reliable than those questioned under pressure. Fear-based interrogation reinforced resistance. Calm persistence, by contrast, created cracks. Reports from Saipan and Leyte show that interrogators often ended sessions early when prisoners declined to speak. No punishment followed. Days later, some of those same prisoners requested to speak again, on their own terms. This pattern was especially pronounced among women. Unlike frontline infantry, many female prisoners were not trained to resist interrogation techniques. They carried operational knowledge incidentally, hospital locations, supply movements, evacuation routes. When given control over the interaction, some eventually shared information without realizing its value. The right to refuse created a sense of agency. An agency, paradoxically, reduced resistance. The leadership angle, command, discipline, and restraint. Maintaining this policy required discipline. American camp commanders were under immense pressure. Intelligence was urgently needed. Casualties were high. The temptation to accelerate questioning was real. Yet records show repeated reinforcement of interrogation standards from higher command. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters emphasized compliance with power regulations as both a moral and strategic necessity. Violations were investigated. Orders were circulated reminding officers that mistreatment undermined long-term objectives. This consistency mattered. It ensured that when Japanese women were told they could refuse interrogation, the statement carried weight. It was not dependent on the personality of a single officer. It was systemic. The enemy perspective, collapse of assumptions. From the Japanese side, the impact was profound. Captured documents and post-war testimonies reveal that many Japanese prisoners struggled to reconcile American behavior with what they had been taught. For women, the shock was often deeper because their roles had been framed as moral anchors of the nation. To survive captivity without coercion felt, to some, like a betrayal, not by themselves, but by the ideology that had promised certainty. Some women clung to that ideology to the end. Others began to question it quietly. The option to refuse interrogation became a symbol. It represented a world where authority did not rely on fear, a concept alien to imperial doctrine. And it set the stage for the moment when this contradiction became undeniable, when refusal was exercised, respected, and absorbed into daily camp life. That moment marked a turning point. The turning point did not arrive with violence or confrontation. It arrived with restraint. In late summer of 1944, at a U.S. POW holding facility established after the Battle of Saipan, American intelligence officers began formal, scheduled interrogations of newly captured Japanese personnel. Among them were women taken from collapsed medical units and administrative bunkers in the island's northern sector. The procedures were standardized. Prisoners were brought in individually. Interpreters were present. Identification was confirmed. Medical condition noted. Then questioning began, slowly, methodically. And when hesitation appeared, the process stopped. Multiple after-action intelligence reports describe moments when Japanese women either fell silent or explicitly declined to answer. In those cases, interrogators closed their notebooks. Chairs were pushed back. Guards were instructed to escort the prisoner out. No penalty followed. This was the moment when the policy ceased to be theoretical. Other prisoners watched closely. In tightly controlled camp environments, behavior traveled faster than rumor. When women who had refused interrogation returned unharmed, fed, housed, unpunished, something shifted. For the first time, refusal was proven to be real. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. American officers recorded visible disbelief. Some prisoners requested confirmation again, asking interpreters to repeat the explanation. Others waited days before testing the rule themselves. In Okinawa, the following year, the pattern repeated on a larger scale. As U.S. forces advanced across the island in the spring of 1945, they captured hundreds of Japanese personnel, including women from field hospitals and communications units. Temporary interrogation centers processed prisoners continuously. Here, too, refusal was honored. Interrogation logs show that some sessions ended after a single question. Others never began at all. The absence of consequence became undeniable. The policy was no longer an anomaly. It was routine. 4 Japanese women raised under absolute authority. Routine restraint was destabilizing. Authority, they had been taught, expressed itself through punishment. Here, authority expressed itself through control, the confidence to allow defiance without response. This realization did not produce immediate trust. It produced something quieter, internal fracture. American interrogators noted changes. Prisoners began to ask procedural questions. Some requested paper and writing materials. Others asked to speak at later times. The rigid posture of total resistance softened, not into compliance, but into contemplation. The climax of this story is not a confession or a breakthrough disclosure. It is the moment when fear lost its certainty. And that moment carried consequences far beyond the interrogation room. Once refusal became accepted fact rather than rumor, its effects spread quietly through the camps. The Japanese women who had tested the rule and returned without consequence became reference points. Not informants, not collaborators, simply evidence. In environments shaped by surveillance and suspicion, evidence mattered more than reassurance. American officers did not capitalize on this shift aggressively. There were no mass briefings, no persuasion campaigns. Interrogation schedules remained unchanged. The policy's power lay in its consistency. Over time, camp behavior adjusted. Prisoners began to regulate themselves. Some women continued to refuse all questioning, holding firmly to imperial instruction. Others agreed to limited sessions, answering only non-operational questions. A smaller number chose to speak more freely, not because they were compelled, but because the absence of coercion altered their perception of risk. Intelligence summaries from Okinawa note an increase in voluntary disclosures weeks after initial capture. These were rarely dramatic revelations. More often, they were confirmations, hospital relocations, evacuation timelines, shortages of medical supplies. Information that refined American operational awareness rather than transforming it. Yet the psychological impact was far greater than the intelligence gained. For the women involved, the realization that refusal carried no punishment forced a reassessment of everything they had been taught about power. The enemy, it turned out, did not need fear to enforce control. That contradiction weakened the ideological structure that had framed surrender as annihilation. Some American interrogators recognized this shift in real time. Notes describe prisoners appearing calmer, more attentive, less rigid in posture. Not friendly, not cooperative in the conventional sense, but no longer locked into absolute resistance. This restraint also prevented escalation. In other theaters of war, harsh interrogation practices often hardened prisoners against all cooperation. In the Pacific, where surrender already carried immense stigma, restraint prevented further entrenchment. It allowed psychological distance to grow between prisoners and the ideology that had demanded their death. 4 Japanese women, whose roles had been defined as moral extensions of the state, this distance was especially destabilizing. The certainty of obedience dissolved not through argument, but through lived experience. By the time the fighting ended, many of these women would carry memories not of brutality, but of contradiction, a memory that complicated post-war narratives on both sides. That complication did not end with the war. It shaped the aftermath. The immediate aftermath of allowing Japanese women to refuse interrogation unfolded quietly but systematically across Pacific POW facilities. In Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa, U.S. Army intelligence officers reported that the voluntary policy created a new rhythm in the camps. Prisoners were calmer during roll calls. Fewer attempts were made to escape. Guards noted a reduction in incidents of panic, self-harm, or physical resistance. The American commanders interpreted this not as submission, but as adjustment, an acceptance that survival did not require deception or confrontation. Intelligence outcomes also reflected this new dynamic. While coerced interrogations had historically produced false or exaggerated information, the voluntary approach delivered higher accuracy in the limited information prisoners did provide. Tactical details, such as hospital locations, supply routes, and troop dispositions, were verified more efficiently because the process reduced stress-induced errors. Reports highlight specific cases. A nurse captured on Saipan refused all initial questioning for 3 days. When she finally agreed to answer a single non-critical question, her information confirmed previous reconnaissance, validating U.S. planning without placing the prisoner under duress. Another group of women clerks on Leyte, initially silent, eventually volunteered logistical information regarding field hospitals, only after weeks of observing consistent restraint. These small but cumulative outcomes reinforced the policy's credibility. Officers noted that even the act of allowing refusal carried influence beyond intelligence. It established a behavioral expectation. New prisoners observed their predecessors and learned that the American system operated according to rules, not fear. This created predictability, a psychological framework absent in Japanese military doctrine. For the women themselves, the long-term effects were equally profound. Some began to engage in mundane daily activities, writing letters home, maintaining hygiene, assisting fellow prisoners, or organizing small work details within the camp. These acts were not overtly rebellious. They were adaptations born of safety, structure, and the certainty that defiance carried no punitive risk. It was a subtle reclamation of agency, impossible under the rigid expectations of Imperial Japan. Even among prisoners deeply indoctrinated, cracks began to appear in their understanding of power and honor. Voluntary refusal challenged the idea that all authority relied on fear. Many women recorded in post-war testimonies that witnessing restraint in practice left a lasting impression. We expected punishment. There was none. We did not understand it, and yet we had to live with it. This psychological shift also affected the broader camp ecosystem. Male prisoners, long accustomed to harsher treatments, observed the women's experience and noted the consistency of the American approach. Guards, officers, and intelligence personnel became more confident in the policy's application, reinforcing a cycle of calm, controlled interaction. What began as a small, targeted doctrinal practice expanded to shape the culture of multiple POW facilities in the Pacific Theater. The immediate military outcome was clear. Intelligence was obtained more reliably, camp order was maintained, and prisoner survival rates improved. But the implications extended beyond operations into the realm of ideology, human behavior, and post-war memory. After the war ended in August 1945, Japanese women prisoners who had survived captivity began returning home under repatriation programs organized by Allied forces. For many, the journey was physically taxing and emotionally complex. Ships carried them from islands like Okinawa, Saipan, and Leyte back to Japan, where they confronted a homeland devastated by firebombing, famine, and surrender. Their memories of American camps contrasted sharply with expectations. Unlike the fear and brutality they had been taught to anticipate, they recalled restraint, order, and a consistent observance of rights, including the right to refuse interrogation. Post-war testimonies collected by the U.S. Army and the Allied occupation forces documented these impressions. One former nurse wrote, "We were prepared for cruelty, for humiliation, but we were met with rules. We could say nothing, and nothing happened. It was confusing, terrifying, and yet we survived. Another clerk, returning to her destroyed city in Japan, reflected on the contradiction between her indoctrination and lived experience. The Americans treated us as if we were human. It was hard to understand. We had been taught that surrender was shame. Yet, here we were alive and unpunished. These experiences also became valuable sources for post-war intelligence studies. Analysts noted that the voluntary interrogation model had not only yielded accurate information, but also contributed to the humane treatment of prisoners, reducing potential for rebellion, psychological collapse, or unnecessary fatalities. The policy became a case study for how discipline, consistency, and restraint could achieve operational goals while respecting human dignity. Lessons incorporated into later U.S. military doctrine. Comparisons with other theaters of the war further highlighted the significance of this approach. Soviet and Chinese prisoners of war, for instance, often faced harsher conditions, forced labor, or violent interrogation. The contrast reinforced the moral and practical advantages of allowing refusal within the framework of Allied military ethics. The broader legacy extended into historical memory as well. Japanese women who survived captivity carried these experiences as enduring reminders of human complexity in wartime. Their stories challenged narratives of absolute cruelty on either side, emphasizing instead the nuanced interplay of power, authority, and moral choice. For historians, these accounts serve as evidence of how small procedural decisions, such as permitting voluntary refusal, could ripple outward, influencing not only intelligence gathering, but also the psychological resilience of prisoners, the effectiveness of camp management, and the post-war reconstruction of trust and human understanding. Ultimately, the consequences of this practice were both tangible and intangible. Operational success intertwined with lessons on morality, strategy, and the capacity of restraint to shape history. The story of Japanese women prisoners who were allowed to refuse interrogation is not one of dramatic battles or explosive confrontations. It is a quieter story, a story of human agency, discipline, and the subtle assertion of power through restraint. In the midst of total war, when destruction and coercion were the norm, the simple act of allowing choice became a form of authority stronger than fear. For the prisoners, it challenged assumptions ingrained over a lifetime. That obedience was mandatory, that defiance invited suffering, that honor demanded compliance. Faced with calm, consistent rules, the women were forced to navigate a reality that neither promised punishment nor required compromise. Survival became a measure not of fear, but of understanding, patience, and observation. For the American forces, this approach was both practical and moral. Intelligence gained was reliable. Camp order remained intact. And, importantly, it preserved the integrity of international law and military ethics. Restraint became a weapon in its own right, subtle, disciplined, and effective. The events also speak to the broader human dimension of warfare. Even amid the vast machinery of the Pacific War, individual choices and humane procedures mattered. They left traces on memory, ideology, and history that could outlast explosions, bullets, and battles. They remind us that in the architecture of conflict, control does not always require force. Sometimes it requires trust in structure, in rules, and in the consistency of one's actions. And so, the experience of these women serves as a lasting reflection. That dignity, even in captivity, can survive. That psychological resilience can be nurtured, not coerced. And that the most profound forms of power often operate silently, without threat, reshaping understanding in the hearts and minds of those who once believed fear was the only path to survival. The Pacific War was brutal. Yet within its cruelty, moments like these reveal a quieter human truth. That even in war, choice endures, and with it, the enduring capacity for reflection, learning, and ultimately, survival.